Please, don't let them take me, she whispered, sliding into the seat beside him just as armed men stormed into the restaurant. Nobody else dared look at him directly, but she was too panicked to notice. The man calmly poured himself a drink while the hunters searched table after table. Then their leader spotted her and suddenly went pale instead of angry. The stranger's fingers closed slowly around her hand as he asked, almost amused, "Do you even know who you're hiding behind?" And the second those armed men lowered their heads and bowed to him, she realized she had just dragged the most dangerous mafia boss in Korea into her lie. Welcome to Wonderpath Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. And now, let's begin. The restaurant was called Hineo Blue, a quiet high-end place tucked between two glass towers in Gangnam, the kind of place where powerful men ate in near silence and servers learned not to make eye contact with anyone. It was a Thursday evening in late October, and the scent of ganjang jejang and warm barley tea drifted through corridors lit by amber pendant lights. Becky Stiles had not come here to eat. She had come here because she was running. 3 days ago, she had witnessed something she was never supposed to see. A warehouse deal. Men in suits exchanging briefcases on the south side of Seoul. Photographs taken through a cracked window by accident while she was shooting street architecture for her photography portfolio. She hadn't even known what she was looking at until the men started shooting at each other and one of them spotted her. She ran then too. She'd been running ever since. Tonight they'd found her again. She saw them the moment she stepped through the restaurant's frosted glass doors. 3 men, dark jackets, one hand each tucked inside their coats, eyes scanning systematically across every face in the room. Her contact, the one who was supposed to meet her tonight with a burner phone and a safe house address, was nowhere. She had maybe 30 seconds before they spotted her, and then she saw the empty seat. He was sitting alone at a table near the window, partially shadowed, a single glass of something amber in his hand. The seat across from him was empty. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anyone. The entire restaurant seemed to orbit around him without touching him, servers redirecting their paths, guests leaning subtly away, even the ambient noise of the room seeming to dampen in his vicinity. He had ox-blood red hair, short and sharp at the sides, and even from across the room she could see the edge of ink beginning at his wrist, wrapping upward beneath his rolled cuffs. A dragon, though she wouldn't know that until later, she didn't think. She moved, the chair scraped softly as she dropped into it. Her voice came out barely above a breath. "Please, don't let them take me." She kept her eyes down. "I know this is insane, I know you don't know me, but please, just please." The man did not move. He did not look at her immediately. He lifted his glass and took a slow, unhurried sip, like a man who had nowhere to be and nothing to prove. Around them, the armed men began moving through the restaurant, stopping at tables, scanning faces. Guests shifted nervously. One woman quietly gripped her husband's hand, then their leader, a heavy-set man with a scar across his chin, turned and his eyes found Becky. His face changed. The hard hunter's certainty dissolved into something else. Something that looked very much like dread. His gaze dropped from her to the man sitting across from her, and the color left his face entirely. The man beside Becky set down his glass. His fingers closed over her hand on the table. The touch was deliberate, warm, and terrifyingly calm. He turned to look at her then for the first time, and Becky's breath stopped. He was younger than she expected. Early 20s, sharp jaw, cheekbones cut like architecture, and eyes so dark they seemed to hold their own gravity. Beautiful and dangerous in the way that certain things in nature were, something you wanted to stare at and something your body knew to fear. His mouth curved. Not quite a smile, something more like controlled amusement. "Do you even know who you're hiding behind?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Across the room, the scarred leader had already raised his hand. A signal. The armed men stopped moving. And then slowly the leader lowered his head. His men followed. Not a nod. A bow. The kind that said everything about who held power in this room and who held none. The man beside Becky turned back to his drink. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand, lazy and possessive, like she was already something that belonged to him. "Interesting," he said quietly. "You have terrible taste in hiding spots." His name was Seo Joon-woo. She didn't learn that immediately. She learned it the way you learn things about dangerous things. In pieces, slowly, with the creeping realization that each piece was heavier than the last. What she learned first was that his driver materialized outside the restaurant within 4 minutes of him making a single phone call. What she learned second was that the armed men were gone before she finished her tea. vanished so completely it was as if they had never existed. What she learned third was that he watched her with a quality of attention that felt less like interest and more like assessment, the way you might study something you hadn't decided what to do with yet. He said very little in the car. Just, "Where do you need to go?" She gave him an address. A small Gashiwan near Mapo where she'd been staying under a false name for 2 days. He didn't ask why she needed a false name. He didn't ask about the men who'd come for her. He simply told the driver, and the city moved past the darkened windows. When they arrived, he didn't get out. But as she reached for the door handle, his voice caught her. "They'll be back. Those men." A pause. "You should know that." She turned to look at him over her shoulder. "I know, then you should also know," he said, unhurried, "that they won't come back while you're under my name." She stared at him. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" He studied her for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, something she couldn't read, something she would spend weeks trying to understand. Then it was gone. "I haven't decided yet," he said simply. "Good night." The next day she told herself she would not think about him. She failed at this by 8 in the morning. She was editing photographs at a small cafe table near her temporary room when her phone rang. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "You left your bag in the restaurant." His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low, unhurried, like a man who had never once been told no and had long since stopped waiting to be. "My people have it. I'll have it delivered. You didn't have to call personally for that," she said. "I know." A pause. "How are you sleeping?" She blinked at her screen. "Excuse me, you looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. I was curious whether that changed." Becky pressed her fingers briefly against her forehead. "That's a strange thing to ask a stranger, is it?" It wasn't a question. She noticed that about him. He made statements that should have been questions, like he already knew the answer and was only speaking aloud as a courtesy. Her bag arrived 2 hours later. Inside it, along with her camera and her notebook, was a small sealed envelope containing a name, an address, and 3 words written in sharp, clean script. "Use this carefully." The address was a safe house. She checked it. It was real. It had been registered 2 hours earlier under a company name she couldn't trace back to anyone. Not without very specific knowledge of how shell corporations worked in Seoul's underworld. Seo Joon-woo had set up a safe house for a woman he'd met once, for 40 minutes, in a restaurant. She sat down on the edge of the Gashiwan bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. A few days later, the safe house turned out to be a sleek apartment on the 14th floor of a building in Yongsan with floor-to-ceiling windows and a refrigerator that had been fully stocked before she arrived. She wasn't sure whether to be grateful or alarmed. She settled on both. He showed up on the 3rd day. No warning. She opened the door and he was simply there, leaning against the hallway wall, looking like he'd been standing there for years and was unbothered by the weight. He was wearing a dark coat, hands in his pockets. The sleeve had ridden up slightly on one arm, and she saw the dragon tattoo fully for the first time, inked in deep cobalt and black, coiling from his wrist up his forearm, alive-looking, almost breathing. "You should check who's at the door before you open it," he said. "I looked through the peephole," she said. "I still don't know who you are." Something about that amused him. Becky Stiles, born in Lagos to a Korean-Nigerian mother and an American father, 23 years old, freelance photographer, no criminal record, currently in possession of photographs you shouldn't have, the blood drained from her face. "Not the enemy," he said quietly, reading her expression with uncomfortable accuracy. "If I were, you wouldn't be standing there. I need to understand what you saw. What's actually on those photographs?" "Because the men who came for you in that restaurant work for someone I know. And that complicates things for both of us." She let him in. She wasn't sure she had a real choice. But she noticed, when she stepped aside to let him pass, that he paused in the doorway as if waiting for full permission. He didn't push through. He waited for her to step back. That detail lodged itself somewhere in her chest and refused to leave. They sat across from each other at the kitchen island, and she showed him the photographs on her laptop screen, frame by frame. He was quiet through all of it, completely still. The kind of stillness that had nothing to do with passivity and everything to do with control. When the last image appeared, a close-up of a face in profile, Joon-woo's jaw tightened so slightly she almost missed it. "You know him," she said. "Yes." "Is he dangerous?" He looked up at her then, and something in his expression was so honest it startled her. "Everyone in that photograph is dangerous, including the people they work for, including me." She held his gaze. "Then why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a moment. The late afternoon light from the windows fell across him in bars of gold and shadow, and he looked in that light, briefly and unexpectedly human. "Because you sat down next to me," he said. "And you asked me not to let them take you." His voice was entirely even. "I don't forget things like that." Becky looked down at her hands. Her pulse was doing something it had no business doing. "That's not a reason. That's just a fact. Sometimes facts are the only reasons that matter." That evening he sent food. Not ordered to the door, actual restaurant food. From a place she mentioned offhandedly when they'd talked about the neighborhood. A small Korean-Nigerian fusion spot run by a woman named Mrs. O, who made jollof rice with doenjang broth that Becky had described as the only thing in Seoul that tasted like both halves of her. She hadn't even been sure she remembered saying it. She'd said it in passing, barely a sentence. The delivery came with no note. She stood at the kitchen counter eating Mrs. O's food in the 14th floor apartment of the most dangerous man in Korea and tried very hard not to feel anything. She failed at that too. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them she hadn't expected. He checked in. Not constantly. He wasn't that obvious about it, but enough. A message in the morning to confirm her building's security hadn't been compromised. A call in the evening that sometimes lasted 4 minutes and sometimes lasted an hour. The conversation drifting from the situation to other things. Easier things. Her photography. His childhood in Busan. The particular quality of Seoul light in November. The way she said certain Korean words with a Nigerian inflection that he described, once, with the kind of carefully neutral voice that meant he was choosing not to say the word beautiful, as having a distinct sound. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. The danger hadn't disappeared. If anything, it deepened. The man in her photographs, a mid-level broker named Park Sung-chul who operated between Seoul's legitimate business world and its shadow economy, had apparently reported the photographs to his employer. That employer was a man named Kwon D-sik. Old money, older cruelty, the kind of power that wore tailored suits to political fundraisers and ordered disappearances from behind mahogany desks. And Kwon D-sik, it turned out, was the single person in South Korea that even Seo Joon-woo approached with something adjacent to caution. Not fear, but awareness of what destruction looked like when it was patient and institutional. "He has infrastructure I don't have," Joon-woo told her one evening, standing at the apartment window, looking down at the city. "Legal insulation, political allies, people who can make things disappear and make it look like paperwork. Can he get to me?" she asked. A long pause. "Not if I have anything to say about it." He turned from the window and looked at her, and his voice was very quiet. "I won't let him touch you." She believed him. That was the terrifying part. What she hadn't anticipated was his people. Min-yi was the first one she met properly. Joon-woo's second in command, a few years older, with a calm face and the particular kind of politeness that comes from someone who knows exactly how dangerous they are and has decided today not to show it. He brought files to the apartment one afternoon when Joon-woo was delayed, and he sat across from Becky at the kitchen island and briefed her on the evolving situation with the efficiency of someone reading a weather report. "Kwon has put additional surveillance on 3 of the exits from this building," he said, sliding a folder across to her. "We've redirected 2 of them. The 3rd one is still active. Don't use the east stairwell." She looked at the folder and then at him. "You've been monitoring the building since I moved in." "Yes," he said simply. "Does he know you're telling me this?" Min-yi looked at her with the expression of someone who found the question mildly interesting. "He told me to tell you whatever you needed to know to feel safe." His words were, "She doesn't like not knowing things. Tell her everything." Becky was quiet for a moment. He said that, yes. She looked back at the folder. "He's been paying attention." "Stiles," Min-yi said, and his voice carried something dry and careful and precise. "The boss has been paying attention since the first night. I've worked for him for 4 years. I've never seen him pay attention like this." He gathered his things and left before she could respond to that. She sat at the island for a long time after the door closed, staring at nothing, her pulse doing that thing again. It was the night of the Han River Benefit Gala when everything started to crack open. Joon-woo had insisted she attend, not as a guest, as cover. A photographer legitimately hired, her real profession her camouflage. The gala was full of Kwon D-sik's circle, and Joon-woo needed to understand who had been briefed about her photographs and who remained uninformed. She was the one person who could move freely through the space without raising alarms. He would be there. He would watch. She would photograph, and if she saw Park Sung-chul, she would signal. She wore a deep burgundy dress that she'd owned since a wedding in Lagos 2 years ago, fitted and floor-length, her natural curls pinned up but soft around her face. She had never thought much about the way she looked in the dress. She spent approximately 7 seconds thinking about it in the elevator mirror before stepping into the gala hall. She would think about it significantly more after watching Seo Joon-woo see her. He was already in the hall. She spotted him across the room, impossible not to. He had a particular quality of presence. And she moved toward him through the crowd, and the moment he saw her, he stopped talking to the man beside him mid-sentence. Just stopped. His eyes did something that she cataloged carefully and refused to name. They moved over her once, controlled, measured, the way he did everything. Then they came back to her face and stayed there. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, smiling despite herself. He closed his mouth. But the look stayed. Park Sung-chul arrived 40 minutes into the gala. Becky spotted him near the bar, photographing the crowd as cover, her camera her shield. She sent the signal, a brief, specific message through the app Joon-woo had installed on her phone. Then she moved to a new position. What she didn't see coming was Min Seok. He was a photographer too, working the gala for a magazine. Afro-Korean like her, a few years older, easy smile and the kind of confidence that came from being comfortable in his own skin. He recognized her work. He'd apparently followed her Instagram for a year, and he found her near the east wall with the genuine delight of someone who'd unexpectedly run into a professional hero. "Becky Stiles," he said, grinning. "You're the one who did the Lagos Coast series. I've been trying to find contact information for you for months." She laughed. It surprised her, a real laugh, unstrained. "I go dark for long stretches. Occupational hazard. I'll take whatever I can get," he said warmly. He wasn't flirting exactly. Or maybe he was, but gently, in the way of someone who valued genuine connection over performance. They talked for 10 minutes about light, about angles, about the particular challenge of photographing powerful people who were professionally trained not to be photographed honestly. She didn't notice Seo Joon-woo until she happened to glance up. He was standing 15 feet away. He wasn't looking at Min Seok. He was looking at her. And his expression was the thing that stopped her breath, not angry, not cold, not any of the things she might have named. It was the face of someone working extremely hard to stay completely still, jaw set, eyes unreadable, watching her laugh with another man with the kind of contained intensity that vibrated in the air between them across 15 feet of Gala Hall. He turned away before she could react, disappeared into the crowd. Later that night, when the gala was over and the car had taken her back to the apartment and Joon-woo had not come up but had simply said good night in the elevator in the tone of someone ending a phone call, she lay in bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and admitted to herself, finally, what had been happening for weeks. She was in trouble, not the Kwon D-sick kind. The other kind. He was cooler the next day, not unkind, just contained. He came by briefly to debrief on what they'd confirmed at the gala, and he was professional, thorough, and precise. He didn't look at her the way he had the evening before across the gala hall. He looked at her the way he looked at information. She wasn't sure which version frightened her more, "You and that photographer," he said at the end, standing near the door. His voice was entirely neutral. "Min Seok, you know him? I met him last night." She watched him carefully. Confirming. He pocketed his phone. "He has a connection to someone in Kwon's circle. Might be nothing. I'll look into it." She stared at him. "Joon-woo," he looked up. "Is that actually why you're asking?" He held her gaze for a moment that lasted too long to be nothing. Then, "I'll be in touch." He left. She pressed her palm flat against the closed door and breathed through the frustration of loving a man who was made entirely of controlled distance. 3 days later, Min Seok was cleared. No connection to Kwon. Joon-woo informed her of this in the most specifically casual tone she had ever heard a human being produce, and she had to turn away so he wouldn't see her smile. He stayed for tea that evening, which was new. They sat at the kitchen island in the amber late afternoon light, and he asked her about Lagos. Not about her work, but about the place itself, the way the ocean looked from the mainland, the particular kind of noise a city makes when it has too much life to contain. She talked and he listened with that total, consuming attention he gave everything, and at one point she looked up mid-sentence and caught him watching her face with an expression so unguarded she lost her train of thought entirely. She said nothing, he said, but he didn't look away for another full second before he did. She thought about that full second for the rest of the evening. It was Minyi who told her, carefully and without editorializing, that there had been a second attempt to locate her. Not the armed men in a restaurant kind. The quieter kind, a woman hired to befriend the building's cleaning staff, gather information about which floor she was on, report back to one of Kwon's satellite operatives. She had been identified and redirected within 24 hours. He handled it before you could worry about it, Minyi said. He handles a lot of things before I can worry about them, she said. Minyi's expression was carefully neutral. That's correct. That night she called Joon-woo herself. He answered on the second ring, which she had learned was fast for him. You didn't tell me about the woman, she said, a brief pause. There was nothing to tell, it was managed. Want to know when things happen? Even managed things, it would have worried you unnecessarily. Joon-woo. Her voice was even. I'm not someone who needs to be protected from information. I can handle knowing things. What I can't handle is finding out later that you were shielding me. A longer pause this time. When he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted very slightly, but she heard it. Understood, he said. I'll tell you. You, not what I'm used to, he said then, almost to himself. What does that mean? It means, he said carefully, that the people in my life generally prefer to know less. Not more, I'm not the people in your life, no, he agreed. And the way he said it, quiet and certain and final, made her breath catch. You're not. The danger arrived without warning on a Tuesday evening. She had gone to Mrs. O's restaurant for the first time in person, a small, warm, crowded spot on a side street. And she had sat alone and eaten jollof rice with doenjang broth, and thought about home, and about what home meant now, and about a man with a dragon tattoo who had not once, in all the weeks she'd known him, failed to check whether she was safe. She was walking back to the building when the van came. It happened fast. The way these things always did in the movies, and didn't in real life. Feel anything like the movies, no soundtrack, no slow motion. Just hands and a door opening and the street going sideways, and then a sound she recognized as her own scream, and then nothing. He knew before anyone called him. That was what Minyi, his second-in-command, would say later, about the 40 seconds between the location alert from Becky's phone cutting out and Joon-woo's first call to his network. That the boss had already known. That the boss had gone somewhere behind his eyes that Minyi had only seen twice before, both times preceding events that became permanent features of Seoul's criminal geography. Find her, was all he said. And then quieter to no one. Now, what followed were 3 hours that Minyi would later describe, carefully and to no one outside the organization, as the most focused he had ever seen Joon-woo operate. Every resource, every contact, every favor owed across 6 years of careful alliance building, called in simultaneously, without hesitation, without the usual calculation of cost. The boss did not calculate costs that night. He simply moved, and everyone around him moved with him, because there was something in his face that made calculation feel inappropriate. She came to in a room that smelled like concrete and something industrial, her wrists zip-tied to a chair, a light overhead, 2 men sitting across from her. The scarred one she recognized from the restaurant, the other she didn't know. They wanted the photographs. Specifically, they wanted the drive, the original raw files. She told them she didn't have it with her. That was true. She had sent it somewhere they would never find. Also true. She did not, however, feel particularly brave about any of this. She was shaking in a way she couldn't control, and her mind was very loudly running through every possible version of what happened next, and most of them were not good. Someone will come for you, the scarred man said. His Korean was flat, regional. And when they do, it won't be who you think, she thought. He's wrong about that, too. She thought about Joon-woo's thumb moving across the back of her hand in the restaurant. She thought about the way he'd waited in the doorway for permission. She thought about a full second of unguarded looking and the way he'd said, "You're not the people in my life." She held on to all of it, very tightly, while she worked her wrists against the zip tie the way he had shown her 3 weeks ago, almost idly, the way he showed her things. She held on and waited. He came himself. She learned this later in pieces from things Minyi let slip. That Joon-woo had located the warehouse within 3 hours. That he had not, as protocol usually demanded, sent his people first and waited. That he had gone in with them. That when he came through the door of the room where she was being held, he was entirely composed on the surface and burning alive underneath it, which anyone who knew him could see in the particular set of his shoulders, and the way his hands were very, very still. The men in the room made one mistake. They looked at him instead of her. She used the moment to break the zip tie against the chair edge the way he had shown her 3 weeks ago, almost idly, the way he showed her things like she would never need them but she should know anyway. When she stood up, he was already across the room. He didn't say anything. He pulled her against him with one arm, hard, his hand at the back of her head, and held on. She felt his chest expand against her cheek, one long, controlled breath. Then another. The shake she'd expected in a man who'd just come through violence was not there. He was perfectly steady, but she could feel his heartbeat, and it was not steady at all. "I told you," he said into her hair, voice low. "I told you they wouldn't touch you." She pressed her face into his coat and didn't speak for a long moment. "You came yourself," she finally said. "Yes, that's not protocol." No, she pulled back enough to look at him. His face was arranged in its usual controlled expression, but something in his eyes had come undone slightly, something raw and honest and completely unguarded. She had never seen him look at anything the way he was looking at her right now. "Joon-woo," she said. "Don't," he said, and his voice broke slightly on the word. "Don't say anything rational right now. Give me 1 minute." She didn't say anything. She gave him the minute. Later that night, back at the apartment, they sat in the kitchen in the dark because neither of them had thought to turn the lights on, and the city glowed through the windows, and she told him about being afraid, and he listened the way he always listened, completely, without moving, without offering comfort prematurely, letting her get to the end of the things she needed to say before he responded. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "When they told me the signal cut out, he stopped. His hands were flat on the table and he looked at them. This man who never looked anywhere without purpose, looking at his own hands as if they were foreign to him. "I have been afraid of very few things in my life. I was not a fearful child and I am not a fearful man." He said it without pride, as a plain fact. "I don't have many things that can be taken from me. I've been careful about that. For years I've been very careful about that." He looked up at her. "And then you sat down next to me." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Becky had ever experienced. She stood up. He watched her completely still, not reaching for her, not pushing, just watching. She walked around the island. She stopped in front of him. She put her hand on his face, her palm against his jaw, which was a thing she had wanted to do since approximately the second week, and she felt the muscle there tighten beneath her hand, and she felt him exhale. "You are incredibly frustrating," she told him. "Been told," he said quietly. "You have spent weeks being careful and controlled and not saying the thing." "I know." "Joon-woo, I know, Becky." She kissed him. He kissed her back like a man who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time and had finally let go, his hands coming up to frame her face, thumbs at her cheeks, the kind of closeness that felt like falling and landing at the same time. The city lights fell across them through the glass. The room was warm. Neither of them said another word for a long time. She woke before him. The light was early and blue, the particular shade of Seoul before 7, and she lay there in the warmth of it and the warmth of him and felt the shift happening in her chest. That specific, terrifying softness of someone who had let their guard down entirely and now had to decide what to do about it. She was afraid, not of him, of how much this had already become. Of the way his breathing in sleep was the steadiest thing she'd ever heard. Of the way he'd looked at her last night with that unguarded honesty and said, "I have been careful about that. For years I've been very careful about that." And the thing he hadn't quite said was that she had undone all of it. She thought about what his world was, what it required, what it cost. She thought about Minyi's face when he'd looked at her in the warehouse, the way his expression said, "You're something the boss does not want to lose, and people use what the boss does not want to lose." She thought about all of this while the light grew from blue to gold, and she slipped carefully out of bed, and she wrote him a note on the kitchen counter, and she left. He read the note at 7:42 in the morning. "I'm sorry. I think I needed last night to be true more than I thought about what comes after. Your world requires things I don't know how to survive. I don't want to be the thing they use to get to you. I don't want to become a liability when you deserve to be protected by something, not endangered by it. This is me trying to care about you by not staying." He read it twice. Then he set it down and sat at the kitchen island and looked at the city for approximately 2 minutes, during which he was entirely still. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and went to find her. She hadn't gone far. She hadn't had anywhere to go that was farther than the Gashiwan near Mapo, which was where she'd been when all of this started, which turned out to be where she went when she was scared. Back to the beginning. Back to where she knew the layout and the exit routes and the owner didn't ask questions. He found her within 4 hours. She opened the door to his knock because she knew his knock by then, a particular 3-count, unhurried, and she stood in the doorway of the small room and he stood in the corridor looking like a man who had something to say and was going to say all of it. "The note," he said. "I meant it," she said. "No, you meant it." His voice was very even. Every word was thoughtful, and I understand the logic of each one. "You're trying to protect me, yes, by leaving, yes." He looked at her with those dark, still eyes. "I need you to understand something. In my world, the thing I choose to protect is rarely the thing that endangers me. It's usually the thing that makes me more dangerous because it gives me a reason." A pause. "I have been operating without a reason for a long time. Just infrastructure, just power for the sake of it." He stepped forward, and she held her ground in the doorway. "You are not a liability," he said quietly. "You are the only thing in years that has felt like something worth protecting because I wanted to, not because I was supposed to." Becky's throat was tight. "Joon-woo, don't leave again," he said. It wasn't a command. It was the least guarded thing she'd ever heard him say. "I will keep asking you not to. I'll ask as many times as it takes. But I'd rather spend the energy proving to you that staying is worth it." She stared at him. "You came all the way here," she said, "to say that." "I'd have gone farther," he said simply. She stepped back. "Let him in." He came through the door and she closed it behind him, and when she turned around, he was standing in the middle of the small room looking at her like she had always been the answer to a question he'd spent years trying not to ask. "Impossibly dramatic for someone so controlled," she told him. "Only with you," he said, and the small smile he gave her undid everything she'd been trying to hold together. The resolution with Kwon D-sik took another 3 weeks. It involved things Becky was partially shielded from, conversations in rooms she wasn't in, an internal war between old alliances and new ones, the surfacing of financial records that Kwon had apparently believed buried. Joon-woo had been building a case for 2 years. The photographs she'd accidentally taken had given him a piece he'd been missing. She gave the raw drive to his lawyers, officially, with documentation. The case went to a prosecutor Joon-woo trusted, one of the few clean ones he maintained a relationship with, a woman named Judge Park who had no love for Kwon and every reason to build one. Park Sung-chul cooperated when presented with the alternative. During those 3 weeks, something between Becky and Joon-woo settled into a new shape. Not the careful orbiting of the first month, something closer. He was at the apartment more often, staying later, sometimes not leaving at all. He learned which drawer she kept her camera charger in. She learned that he took his coffee with nothing in it and drank it standing up, which she found both characteristically controlled and faintly ridiculous. She told him so. "It's efficient," he said. "It's lonely," she said. "Sit down and drink your coffee like a human being." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out the kitchen stool and sat down. He drank his coffee. He watched her move around the kitchen with that particular attention of his, and after a moment the corner of his mouth moved. "Better?" he asked. She said, and turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her smile. Kwon D-sik was arrested on a Thursday morning, and the news broke across Seoul by noon, and Becky watched it on the apartment television with a cup of tea and a feeling that was difficult to name, not victory exactly. Something quieter. Relief. The sense of something having been resolved that she hadn't been sure would be. Joon-woo was across the city for most of it, managing the fallout in his own world, the shifting of power that happened when someone Kwon's size went down. He called her twice. The first call was brief, just checking she was inside. She was safe, that the building's security had no anomalies. The second call lasted an hour. They talked about everything except the resolution, which neither of them needed to discuss because it had already happened. They talked about her next project, a photography series she wanted to shoot in the narrow alleys of Jeonju. He told her he'd grown up near there, that he knew a man who ran a guest house who made the best sikhai she'd ever tasted. "You want to come?" she asked, more casually than she felt. A pause. "Are you asking?" "Asking, then yes," he said. "Obviously yes." December arrived, and with it the first real cold of the Seoul winter, the kind that made breath visible and put frost on the window glass at night. Joon-woo's world had restabilized. A new order, careful alliances, the slow work of someone repositioning power rather than simply wielding it. He was different in December than he'd been in October, subtly but perceptibly. Less contained. Like something that had been held very tightly for a long time had been very carefully, deliberately loosened. She photographed him once. He didn't know she did it. They were in the kitchen of the Yongsan apartment, which had, at some point in November, become a space that held both of them instead of just her. His coffee on her counter, his coat on her hook, his particular silence occupying rooms the way his presence always did. He was reading something on his phone, leaning against the counter, and the morning light came through the window at an angle that caught the edge of his jaw and the beginning of the dragon tattoo at his wrist and the rare, completely unguarded expression on his face of someone who was comfortable, genuinely comfortable, in a place they thought of as home. She kept that photograph. She never told him. There were other moments she kept too, not on camera, but in the quieter storage of memory. The night it snowed for the first time that winter, and he stood at the window watching it with an expression she hadn't seen before, something softer than his usual stillness, something almost boyish, quickly covered when he felt her watching. The afternoon she cried, unexpectedly, over something small and unrelated to any of it, a song on her phone, a message from her mother in Lagos, and he sat beside her on the couch and didn't say anything, just put his arm around her and let her lean into him until it passed. And when it did, he handed her tea without being asked, because he had already made it. The evening she fell asleep on the couch over her editing and woke up with a blanket she hadn't put there, and the apartment was still warm, and his coat was still on the hook. He was always doing that, showing up quietly in the spaces between the words. It was in the second week of December that his mother called. Becky learned about this the way she learned most things about his internal world, indirectly, through the particular quality of his silence afterward. She came home from a shoot to find him standing at the window in the dark, still in his coat, not having turned the lights on. She turned them on. He turned around. "Everything all right?" she asked. "My mother wants to meet you," he said. "The room was very quiet. She knows about me," Becky said carefully. "She's known for a while." He paused. "My mother knows most things before I tell her. It's one of her more exhausting qualities." "She wants to meet you." "Yes." He watched her face. "You don't have to." "I told her it was up to you." Becky set her camera bag down slowly. "What is she like?" He considered this with the care he gave everything. "She is the most stubborn person I have ever met," he said. "And I include myself in that comparison. She is also," he added more quietly, "the only person in my life who has never been afraid of me. She sees through everything, every wall I've built, every version of myself I've constructed for the world." A beat. "She'll see through yours too." "Is that a warning? It's a fact," he said. "I thought you liked facts." She met his eyes. Something in them was steady and waiting and more vulnerable than he would ever admit out loud. This was his world too, not just the dangerous parts. The human parts. His mother's voice on a phone call in the dark. "Set it up," she said. Something released in his shoulders that she didn't think he knew was tense. "Thank you," he said, just that. Madame Seo was a small woman in her late 50s, who wore her silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, and looked at Becky for approximately 10 full seconds without speaking when they met at a private dining room in Insadong that Joon-woo had booked for the occasion. Joon-woo stood beside Becky doing something she recognized by now as his version of nervous, completely still, completely controlled, eyes tracking his mother's expression. Then Madame Seo said, in precise English, "You're the photographer." "Yes," Becky said. "My son does not bring people to meet me," Madame Seo said. "In 24 years, he has never once brought anyone to meet me." She looked at Joon-woo. "Sit down, you look like a soldier." She looked back at Becky. "You sit too. Tell me about Lagos." Joon-woo sat. The relief on his face was so microscopic that only Becky, who had spent months learning to read him, could see it. It was the strangest lunch of her life and also, by its end, one of the warmest. Madame Seo was exacting and direct, and occasionally cutting in the way of someone who decided long ago that time was too short for softness that wasn't earned. But she listened to Becky the same way Joon-woo listened, completely, with full attention, following every thread. When Becky described her photography, the Lagos Coast series, the idea behind the Jeonju project, Madame Seo's expression did not perform interest. It simply was interested. At the end of the lunch, as they were putting on their coats, Madame Seo touched Becky's arm lightly. "My son," she said quietly, "has spent his whole life learning not to need things. I have watched him become very good at it." She paused. "You broke something open in him, I can see it." She studied Becky's face. "Don't let him close it again. He'll try. It's his instinct." She left before Becky could respond. Joon-woo appeared at Becky's shoulder a moment later. "What did she say?" "She gave me instructions," Becky said. He looked wary. "About what about you?" She picked up her bag. "Don't worry, I'm going to follow them." He looked at her for a long moment. I'm not sure whether to be concerned or relieved, both, she said. Probably both. He proposed on a night in January that started ordinarily dinner at Mrs. O's, the restaurant full of winter warmth, the jollof rice and doenjang exactly as they had always been. He had been quieter than usual all evening, which for Joon-woo meant a specific quality of stillness, thinking, still rather than watching still, turned slightly inward. She noticed. She said nothing. She gave him the space the way she'd learned to give him space, which was to say she remained entirely present while he worked through whatever he was working through. They were walking home through the cold, the street lit amber and strung with December lights that were technically too late, and that no one had taken down yet, and he stopped walking, which stopped her. And when she turned to look at him, he had his hands in his coat pockets and an expression she had seen only once before. The face he'd made in the Gashiwan corridor when he said don't leave again, the most unguarded version of him, the one she kept in her chest like a photograph. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. He paused, choosing words with the precision he gave everything. I have spent my life building a world that didn't require me to need anything. I was very good at it. I thought it was strength. He looked at her. I think now it was just avoidance. Joon-woo, she said softly. I'm not good at asking for things, he continued. I'm aware of that. You've been patient with it in a way that I haven't deserved. His jaw worked. I don't want to spend the rest of my life being careful about you from a distance. I want to be, he stopped. Something moved across his face, something young and raw and completely honest. I want to be near you, all the time, officially. In whatever way you're willing to have me. He took one hand out of his pocket. He was holding a ring. Not ostentatious, clean and precise, a dark stone set simply, exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen herself. She didn't ask how he knew. She already understood, somewhere deep and settled, that he had been paying attention to her since the very first night. That he catalogued her the way she catalogued light, carefully, and for keeps. Becky Stiles, he said, and his voice was entirely steady except at her name, where it wasn't. Will you stay? She looked at him in the amber-lit January street, this dangerous, careful, completely impossible man who had shown up for her in every way that mattered since the night she'd hidden behind him without knowing what she was hiding behind. I told you once, she said. You came all the way to Mapo to ask me not to leave. Remember. Think my answer then was yes, she said. My answer now is still yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and his hands stayed around hers for a moment in the cold, warming them, and she stepped into him and he wrapped his arms around her and the city moved around them without touching them, which was exactly what cities always did around Seo Joon-woo. You are the most difficult woman I have ever met, he said into her hair. You love it, she said. He held her tighter. Completely, he agreed. They were married in April, in a small ceremony in Jeonju, the city he'd grown up near, the city she'd always meant to photograph, the one that smelled of traditional paper and spring rain and the particular sweetness of sikhai from the guest house run by the man who knew Joon-woo's face and wept quietly during the ceremony from the second row. Min-yi stood beside Joon-woo. Becky's friend Dara, who had flown in from Lagos carrying far too many outfits and a Bluetooth speaker she played Afrobeats from at the reception, stood beside her. Mrs. O catered and spent most of the evening telling guests about the jollof rice with doenjang broth as if she had invented love itself. Madame Seo sat in the front row in a deep blue dress and cried silently and precisely, in the way of someone who had decided that this occasion earned tears, but that they would be dignified about it. When Becky caught her eye mid-ceremony, the older woman gave a single, small nod. A nod that said, good. A nod that said, don't let him close it again. A nod that said, you did well and so did he, and I'm glad you found each other. Becky wore ivory shot through with gold thread that caught the light when she moved, her curls loose down her shoulders. And when she came through the doors of the small traditional hall and Seo Joon-woo saw her, really saw her. The way he had that first night at the gala, but without any of the control, all of it gone, just him looking at her with every single thing he felt. She stopped walking for a moment because the expression on his face was the most purely private thing she'd ever been allowed to see. She made herself move forward. He met her halfway. Neither of them had planned that. It just happened. When they were pronounced married, he kissed her and the small room broke into noise, and Dara made a sound that could only be described as a triumphant air horn, and Min-yi stood very still with his hands folded, and the expression of a man trying not to show that he was moved and failing completely. The months after the wedding settled into a life she hadn't dared fully imagine when she was running through Gangnam in late October, her camera bag bouncing against her hip, certain that whatever came next would be dangerous and probably brief. The danger didn't disappear entirely. It never fully did, not in his world. But it changed shape. It became something managed, something bounded, something that existed at the edges rather than the center. Joon-woo was methodical about it. He restructured things, quietly and over time, in ways that she only partially understood, and that Minyi later told her were unprecedented, reducing exposure, strengthening the legal architecture around the organization's legitimate holdings, building the kind of institutional weight that made certain kinds of attacks too costly to attempt. She asked him once why directly. Because, he said, I have things worth protecting now that I didn't have before. He looked at her. I don't mean you specifically. I mean a life, an actual life. He was quiet for a moment. I had a world before. I didn't have a life. She reached across the kitchen island and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held on. She found out she was pregnant in July, on a morning when the Seoul summer was thick and warm and Joon-woo was in a meeting she'd interrupted 3 times already with increasingly thin excuses. She stood in the bathroom holding the test and thought about October. About a restaurant called Hineo Blue. About a seat that had been empty beside the most dangerous man in Korea, and a woman too panicked to know who she was sitting down next to. She thought about the way fear had a way of walking you directly toward the things you were meant to find. She thought about the full second he'd looked at her across the gala hall. About the note she'd left on the counter, and the 3-count knock on the Gashiwon door 4 hours later. About a ring she hadn't chosen, but that fit as if she had. About a small ceremony in a traditional hall in Jeonju, where neither of them had planned to meet in the middle, and both of them did anyway. She came out of the bathroom. He was standing in the kitchen doorway looking at her with the particular attention he gave her when he suspected something was happening that she hadn't told him yet. Well, he said. She held up the test. He went very still. Then slowly, Seo Joon-woo, who was feared by organized crime syndicates, who had outwitted one of Seoul's most institutionally powerful men, who had spent his entire adult life building a world that didn't require him to need anything, crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and wrapped his arms around her and pressed his face into her curls and stayed there. She felt him shake. Once, just once. Hi, she said softly into his shoulder. Hi, he said, and his voice was completely undone. Hi. They stood like that for a long time, in the kitchen where the morning light came through the windows, and the city was noisy outside, and somewhere in the world things were always dangerous and always worth it. The two of them in the particular silence of people who had found, against remarkable odds, exactly where they belonged. He lifted his head eventually and looked at her, and his face held everything, the controlled man and the unguarded one, the dangerous one and the soft one, the one who had sat alone in restaurants with his thumb on the pulse of a city, and the one who had shaken, just once, into her shoulder because something had moved him past the place where control lived. Going to need a bigger apartment, he said. She laughed. It echoed in the kitchen and out through the windows into the Seoul summer morning. We live in a 14th floor penthouse, she said. How much bigger do you need? As big as it needs to be, he said, and he was already smiling, and it was the smile she kept not in photographs, but in the part of her that would never let go of him, and the world that had never been able to touch them kept spinning on. Thank you for watching, besties. If this story had you feeling all the things, please like, share, and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Was it the restaurant? The gala, the note she left, and him going to find her anyway. The lunch with Madame Seo. The moment in the kitchen. Let's talk about it. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, sometimes the most dangerous seat in the room is the one that changes everything. Take care of yourselves. Peace.